Is Heather going to be virtual tonight?
She is, yes. I am virtual.
She's here.
I apologize. I had intended to be there in person, but the baby that was placed with us last week had a cold, and it has been a little bit more difficult than I thought it was going to be. So I am virtual tonight.
Okay, well, it's 7:01 p.m. Let's call the meeting to order. The first order of business is the roll call. So Heather, can you do that remotely?
Yes, I can. Committee member Bowman.
Here.
Committee member Kerr.
Here.
Committee member Papalia.
Yeah.
And Vice Chair Priven.
Here.
And Chair Trainer.
Here. Okay, so I'll read the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lisjon. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community, and we will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. Right, so the second item is the approval of minutes, but there's a note that there were none. I guess, is that because that was a special meeting that we had last time?
I will bring those to the next meeting. I did not have a chance to prepare the minutes in working on the biennial budget. So you'll have this minutes and the ones from last time at your next meeting.
Okay, great.
Excuse me, I have a question about that. In that meeting, there was a motion made that had 3 specific elements and that were recommendations to the council for the sweetened sugar beverage tax. I've already emailed Heather once about what happened to that motion that we made and how it was submitted to the council, because there was only around 4 or 5 words that were included from our motion, then completely left out whatever Kyle had wanted to add. So Heather, is there a copy of the motion somewhere that will be included in the minutes, and how was that communicated to the council?
Will be included in the minutes, and I put the recommendation in the staff report. I did not add the second half. I know that there was a number of back and forth, but it was only one sentence that had 2 parts. I did fail to include the second part, but it will be, that motion in full will be in the minutes at the next meeting.
So you're saying there was a motion that you forwarded or not?
No, I'm saying that a motion was made to recommend to the council that they not, the words were that they not appropriate more than anticipated revenue. And then the second half of the sentence that was in the motion, but I did not end up getting into the staff report, was that especially in years where we are budgeting a deficit.
And then there was Kyle's amendment.
That was all I had. I do not have any additional, anything else from that. If there was, I can go back through the video and see, but
It's at
that was all I had written.
219.43 of the video. And there was an amendment, and I think it was pretty clear, and Kim repeated it, restated it as an amendment, and it was approved unanimously.
Yeah, I have, they should not attribute or allocate more than they should take in. Sounds like that part got included. It is not a special fund. Sounds like that part was not included. And then essentially there is no balance from prior years. This is just part of the general fund.
So if we can go back and get that amendment included to that motion, and then is it possible to have that full recommendation included with the next report to council?
So later on, you guys will be talking about the budget, and you will have members present at the budget committee meeting or the budget study session, and you are more than welcome to include that if you would like to in your presentation.
Okay, so we'll include that. All right, so the agenda item number 3 is announcements, and I do believe that Member Kerr has an announcement.
I have a concern that our agenda is a bit long, and I have a concern that we're not going to get out of here in a timely way. So I'd like to propose that we just slightly revise the agenda so that item 6.5, which is the proposed draft schedule, which will give us a second view meeting on May 24th of the biennial budget. I'd like to move that up so that we can actually approve that early in the game, so that when we get to the biennial budget and the other longer items on the schedule, we can be cognizant that we have another look at those items. So
I apologize, but that is tentative, as in if the council at the study session sends the budget back to the Financial Advisory Committee meeting, or to the Financial Advisory Committee, the budget would not come back to you then unless directed by council at their study session.
We will then have to do a very good job of talking quickly tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so then I guess does anybody else have any other announcements before we get going with the agenda, the rest of the agenda? Okay.
Yes, yeah. So, 2 things. There was a Albany Fair at the Civic Community Center, and there was a booth there for the meetings, committees, and commissions. And I know Mark was there, and I was there, and I saw Judy. Were you behind the booth, or were you just traveling around?
Yes, I was representing the advisory bodies, yes.
So you were, yeah, so we had 3 members behind in the booth there, communicating to the public. And it was kind of, a lot of people didn't know about it. I had put together a flyer that was strictly from the information that we have about our committee and how it's made up and how we were formed. And I've passed that in and like to have that later on as kind of included as part of our agenda in the future, that we acknowledge that. The other thing that I did was there was a coffee with cops here in the parking lot behind the police station. And it was sponsored by the Solano Avenue Association, the business groups. And I went there and I was able to talk to the chief and discuss with him kind of staffing issues and what he thought was going to be possible. He was very pleased that he felt he had a full staff of dispatch for the first time, where they had 8 people to cover. I became aware that there's a lot more than just the police in the police department. There's multiple roles that are played by civilians that are not necessarily police officers, and but that we still may be short 1 to 4 officers. And I asked him that if later on he could send me how things have evolved over the last 3 years in terms of staffing, so we could better understand, since that is one of the major expenses. And he was very glad to be able to help, but he was going to go away on vacation this week. So he said he'll get to it when he gets back.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next item is number 4, and it's public comment. So we do have one member of the public. Did you wish? Okay, So we don't have public comment from those in attendance. Do we have anybody attending by Zoom? Okay. Okay, then we're going to move on to section 5, which is the presentations section. So item 5-1 is a pension presentation by GovInvest.
I will introduce Dan from GovInvest. He is being promoted to a panelist right now. Here we go. Dan, you are muted.
A pension update, and be covering a little bit in pension basics. I understand the committee is a little bit short on time, so I will try. I'm not sure that I can be brief, but I'll try to be briefer. Cover some of the hurdles and considerations associated with that all pension plans across the nation are facing. How your agency is doing relative to its funding tactics, and really not get into too many strategies and tactics, but some brief goals for pension management that we will discuss briefly. In terms of pension basics, CalPERS is a multi-employer retirement system, meaning that they're the administrator for many agencies, very different than many counties and large agencies that administer their own plan. So they administer one set of rules, they write all the checks, they do the investing on behalf of the local agencies. So there is quite economy of scale in this format. But it's important to point out that the promised benefit is really made by the contracting agency, and it's versus actual CalPERS. The promised benefit has been upheld by the California Constitution, known as the California Rule, that the benefits can't really be rolled back except for on a prospective basis. And while exiting CalPERS is possible, it's really not a practical option because essentially the agency goes into a termination status where the plans are valued at a very low safe earnings rate, and the costs really just become cost prohibitive to most local agencies that have looked at that. In 2012, then Governor Brown introduced the Public Employers Pension Reform Act, otherwise known as pension, when it went into effect in January 1 of 2013. And that reduced the benefits from employees effectively hired on or after January 1, 2013 that didn't have prior service with another CalPERS agency. In terms, there are a number of economic and demographic assumptions that end up driving the cost of the plan. Inflation is one that's talked about lately, the investment return, salary growth, a lot of the demographics that you might expect when somebody retires, when they might expire, what their final compensation would be at retirement. But the one assumption that drives the cost the most is really investment income, and we'll explore why on a subsequent slide. But just know that investment income has a large impact on the cost of the plan. And so the costs are made up of two components, the normal cost of accruing additional service credit for your active employees, And then there's a second component that's intended to be a self-correcting mechanism, and this is the amortization of any unfunded accrued liability that is incurred. And that would take place when any experience differs from the
Can we
assumption.
get one slide per
or-
screen?
Sorry?
Excuse me, Dan, would it be possible to show one slide per screen so they're a little bigger instead of having two?
Oh, yeah, let's.
How about that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is that? Okay. So the unfunded component of the actuarial liability is amortized right now over a 30-year period, and it's self-correcting mechanism, so that to the extent the actual differs from the assumed, then the amortization of that unfunded liability gets the system back on track. And so those two components make up the total required contribution. And coming back to this investment earnings, so those normal contributions that are made over the life of an employee. So this hypothetical employee that starts at age 25, retires at age 50, the normal contributions that are set aside to fund this benefit accumulates and is represented by this black line. And what the investment earnings, as you can see, after years of compounding of investment earnings, represent 2/3 or more of the overall benefit cost. So when there is a deviation on investment earnings, it has the same kind of multiplier impact on the cost of the benefit. So it's one of those few long-term liabilities where investment earnings are essentially baked into the cost or assumed to be earned and to offset that future promised benefit. And without those investment earnings, really could dramatically drive up the cost of the program. So if you may recall, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a Senate bill and Assembly bill that enhanced the benefit for public sector employees, known as Senate Bill 400 and AB 616. That was at a time when the housing market was in a boom. We had the .com era going on, and you can see the pension plans were about 128 to 120% funded, and the thought was, well, we can enhance the benefits with virtually little or no cost to the employers. That was under the presumption that the good times would continue on forever. In fact, they did not. And you can see back, and really earlier in my career, the assumed earnings rate was as high as 8.75%. And over time, that assumed earnings rate dropped to 8.25%, 7.75%, down to essentially where we are today at 6.8%. A large part had to do with, if you remember back in the early 90s, you can count on treasury rates, 5, 6, 10%. In the late 80s, early 90s. But since then, the treasuries have been on a 40-year slide. They bottomed out in August of 22, where the 10-year treasury slipped below a little less than, or just about 0.5%. Since that, treasuries have come back But during this time, it became more and more difficult when 30 to 40% of the portfolio is made up of fixed income earning less than 2%. Pension plans across the nation really had to take on more risk in order to guarantee that same benefit without increasing costs exorbitantly. You know, it's since the promised benefit is fixed, as investment income disappears, then that difference is really made up by the employer through that amortization of the unfunded liability. So you can see over time, the red line represents that all-important assumed investment earnings rate. And you can see the 30-year average was about 8.4%, but in the last 20 years, it's slipped down below 6.9%. And in this last evaluation year, when they reviewed actual experience against the assumptions, the look back really, and really the look forward, the forward-looking capital market assumptions really only supported the prospect of earning something close to 6.2%. CalPERS board pushed back and asked the staff to come back with a portfolio that would support a 6.8% assumption moving forward, and that was done through taking on additional leverage and additional investment in private equities. But you can see for every collection of good years, there's usually a period of underperforming. So it does happen in cycles. So, 1 year returns like we saw last year. For every collection of good years, there are going to be some lackluster years. And that's exactly what happened between the val that you received in August of this year was for 21, or June 30th, 21, including a 21.3% return. And we'll see that a dramatic turnaround. So in that 4-year cycle where the assumptions were reviewed against actual experience, the assumed earnings rate was dropped to 6.2%. Inflation, ironically, looking back the last decade, was very low, and the inflation rate was reduced. And wage growth assumption was increased, and there were other demographic assumptions, mainly some modifications to mortality that were made in this last review cycle. So the next time that the board will consider changes to those assumptions will be in another 4 years. So I mentioned the 6/30/21 is the last valuation you received. You received that in August of 22. You will receive your next valuation in August of 23. But the last val that you had an assumption of 7.7%. They actually earned 21.3, generating an experience gain of 14.3%. And I'm sorry, did I detect somebody had a question? So unfortunately.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't understand what the experience gained 7% and actual and then 14%. So if you could elaborate a bit.
Sure. So if we assume 7 and actually earn 21.3%, there was, the variance or the positive experience was that you earned 14 percentage points greater than what you assumed. Is that at all helpful?
And how would that be translated into, is there a, when we look at our pension liability. Is there a number attached to that? How would we use that 14% to understand?
Sure. So that was already baked into the last valuation. And when we look at the trend, what you'll see is that 14% excess earnings, more than they assumed, dramatically improved the funding status. But as we look forward and see the trend reverse, what we'll see is the funded status is projected to drop quite dramatically when you receive your next valuation. So if you can hold on for a few more slides, I think you'll see that a little bit more clearly. In 22, I did mention they changed the assumption going forward. They were assuming that it would earn 6.8%, but the experience loss, they actually lost 6.1% in the market. So really the absolute difference between a positive 6.8% and a negative return resulted in a 12.9% experience loss based on the preliminary results. And so that would be a negative impact on the plan's funded status relative to the June 30th, 21 return.
Dan, I have a quick question. So I understand the purpose of adjusting the discount rate for like forecasting purposes, moving it from 7 to 6.8. But can you help me understand like the tangible impact of doing that? Like, what does that mean for the agencies ultimately that have this liability?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is the normal cost is set assuming that there will be investment earnings to offset the promised liability. And without those assumed investment earnings, you could see that the agencies would have to contribute closer to this blue line in order to accumulate earnings to that projected benefit obligation. As I mentioned, investment earnings offset the cost of the employer's cost of that promised benefit. So the promised benefit is way up here. The cumulative contributions made by employee and employers only really reach this black line, and it's the investment earnings that offset that promised benefit. So if investment earnings go down, the employer contribution, since the promise is not changing, that promised benefit is still way up here. As investment earnings go down, the employee and employer costs go way up.
Got it. Does that result in like a stipulation or a mandate that the cities have to budget more, or how does that actually like communicated?
Yeah, so as part of the valuation that you receive each year, as I mentioned, there are two components in the employer rate, the normal cost and that unfunded component. So to the extent that there is a funding gap or an unfunded component of that liability, let's say we were $20 million short in investment earnings in this last cycle, that $20 million layer would be amortized. CalPERS wouldn't expect you to write a check for that $20 million. They'll say, okay, we'll build that into your rates, into your total required contribution over the next, and spread that over a 20-year period. So all actuarial unfunded losses are amortized. They become essentially a loan layer. So in the year that you would have a gain, you'd have actually a credit. That excessive return of 14.3% is shown as a credit that would be spread into your rates over a 20-year period of time. And conversely, when you have a loss, that loss layer would be amortized into your required contribution rates over 20 years as well. So each year they measure the difference between the assumed and the actual, and they would develop the component of your cost that funding gap that needs to be made over a period of time.
Got it.
And yeah, so as we know, markets are volatile. Investment earnings go up and down, so they're assuming the excessive returns in one year will offset some of the losses in the next year, and vice versa. So it's just a way of smoothing employer contribution rates, but since markets have been so volatile over the last 2 decades, employer costs have been going up dramatically.
And so when the board pulled down the discount rate, that essentially increased the liability.
It increased the liability and the normal cost, as well as created an unfunded liability layer. It was a triple whammy, if you want, if you expect. It's different than one-year experience, gain or loss. When you change an ongoing assumption, it is assumed that forever you will have less investment earnings to offset the cost of that promised liability. So changing those assumptions are very impactful. So when we look at even a situation where it's just a simple example, if we had $10,000 and had an experience gain of 14.3%, that would grow to $11,430. If you have a smaller loss on a larger base of assets, still resulted into a net funding loss for the year, and that was before even considering the changes in assumptions. So that's a simple example. We'll look at your specific numbers here in a minute. And unfortunately, the news got a little worse as the year went on. They identified a preliminary return of negative 6.1%. There are a few technical adjustments that they make after, really in that kind of fall time to adjust for the valuation of private equities. That private assets are not traded daily publicly, so they have to be appraised. That appraisal takes time. So when the June 30th appraisal of the private assets, as well as a technical adjustment that they make for accounting purposes, resulted in an allocation of assets resulting closer to a minus 7.5% return instead of the 6.1 that they announced early in the year. So when we look at include those numbers, so in 21, where they had the positive investment experience, that amounted to almost a $15 million improvement in your funded status. Changing that discount rate by 0.2% or 20 basis points resulted in a funded loss of about $3.3 million. I mentioned they changed some other assumptions that also resulted in a loss, funding loss to your agency. And you have some demographic gains that virtually offset those assumptions by about $530,000 in total, though with that large investment experience gain, you had a large funding improvement. This is what's included in the 21 valuation that you received. Looking forward to the valuation that you will receive in August, Our estimate is that investment experience loss just by itself, not counting any other demographic losses, gains or losses that may be occurred, that will have a net nearly $16 million change in fortune in the funded status of your plan. So when we look forward,
Just a quick question. What's a demographic gain or loss?
Demographic gain would be gain or loss could be somebody working longer than anticipated, or perhaps a retiree expiring earlier than expected, or somebody living longer than their anticipated expected mortality projection.
Dan, I have a follow-up question to Mark's question on that. You mentioned that the CalPERS board would meet again in 4 years to look at other demographic gains or assumption changes. Did they include the decreased life expectancy secondary to COVID in their assumptions in that demographic gain? Or do you know the answer to that?
Not at that time. So it really was pre-COVID when they did the study. About 4 years prior, they had done a study and showed significant mortality improvements, but they realized that, okay, generationally, prohibiting smoking in restaurants are going to help younger generations, but perhaps the 70-year-old.
I understand, yeah. I just wondered if they had included the COVID impact on the decreased life expectancy in the U.S. Thank you.
Yep. So as we see for 2019, your funded status moved from 73% when they assumed 7 and earned 6.8. It stayed relatively, each year, just by paying your amortization of your UL, you would expect your funded status to improve about 1 to 1.5% per year. Because they actually earned slightly less, you had a slight drop in your funded status. At 21% return, you realized a 10% increase in your funded status. And what we're projecting is roughly almost a 10 whole percentage point decrease in your funded status, dropping to roughly where you were before, about 72%. You can see that the accumulated, what the benefits that have been accrued to date, that have been already earned, amount to about $142 million. You have roughly $102 million with CalPERS, and the remaining unfunded liabilities projected to be around $40 million when you receive your valuation next year. How that compares to other agency, you're right about that average agency. The PERF is just the Public Employers Retirement Fund, and you can see that average agency was about 70% in 20, 81% in 21, and about 22% projected through 22. So you're right on top of that average agency. As we look at the demographics of your plan, you still have quite a bit of few that still on your payroll that have that class, are entitled to that classic benefit. But as they transition out of the workforce, you will see a reduced cost, a reduced normal cost. We'll start transitioning out, assuming people retire as actuarially assumed. People, of course, can make their own assumptions, their own decisions to work or stay longer, but for the actuarial tables, this is how your classic benefited employees would likely transition out of the workforce. And when we look at this slide, this incorporates two things. One, by reducing that investment assumption, you can see that normal cost is moving up about looks like about $117,000 a year is what that 2% decrease in in the earnings rate we'll have for your normal cost. Typically, this line would be really on an upward trajectory, moving up, growing about 2.8% per year, because that is the assumed payroll growth assumption. But because you have this transition from more expensive classic employees transitioning out of your workforce, in nominal dollars, your costs remain relatively flat and really don't start to grow until the classics have left the workforce, and you see the cost starting to grow. When you look at that same cost as a percentage of payroll, it's actually on a percentage of payroll basis, your costs are coming down because the cost per employee is coming closer, starting to drift down to that PEPRA benefit rate. So that's a bit of good news. We're starting to see the impact of the PEPRA legislation have impact, at least on your active workforce. When we look at the change in fortune, the green line represented where you were with your 2020 valuation, and your total required contribution was following this trajectory. With the excess returns, you could see it was amortized over a 20-year period, but phased in over this 5-year period. So it was coming down over the next 5 years. Instead, as we include the new loss layers, you're really following the green line or where you were before, but as that 5-year ramp from the 21 loss peaks out, and you have one more year of that 5-year ramp from your 22 expected loss, your losses look like they may peak just over $7 million or over $6 million per year. If there isn't a rebound from the market. And that's one of the reasons they phase in any gain or loss over that 5-year period, is so that to the extent that there is some short-term volatility in the markets, that those gains and losses will offset each other. Clearly, that's what you see between the yellow and red lines, that offset. We would hope before then that there would be some market rebounds. But as finance directors, we have to consider a lot of the other risks that are out there. And while we can hope for the best, we do have to plan for the worst. And between the number of inflation and geopolitical risks that are out there, when we look at where agencies have been hurt the most, it's when CalPERS is underperformed for 3 or more years. In this scenario, we looked at a scenario if CalPERS had not earned anything really in 23, earned a small return of 3% in 24 before earning a larger return. And what that would show following this really purple line is that your costs would continue to drift upwards, even where we expect them to be in 2021, before they would start coming down. Fortunately, as of yesterday's close in 23, they were earning around 4%. It's not likely, unless there's something dramatic that happens in the market, that they'll earn the 6.8%, but it's not as bad as the hypothetical scenario that we were running at 0%. So if they close the books, roughly today, they would have about a 3% experience loss for the year. So some of the way I tend to look at ways to manage pensions, and something that's really not included in your valuation is considering long-term budget flexibility, and it's preserving some liquidity. So before some agencies get anxious about trying to derive some economic savings by sending money to CalPERS to pay down some of the losses or try to increase plan solvency. The first thing that should be considered, really, in my opinion, is making sure you have sufficient liquidity on hand so you can continue to provide service to your community members through economic downturns. And so I think it's oftentimes we can get complacent thinking that things will just continue on. But if there is a downturn, having a sufficient amount of liquidity is important. Then consider perhaps things that you might make extra contributions. Once you fill that liquidity bucket, then you can think about improving the plan solvency. And then there are a number of ways to pay down that liability more aggressively and avoid some interest costs. And that is something I can help staff at how to prioritize those payments, but you really need to make sure you have the liquidity to do that first. Plan solvency, you're right about the average agency, 70% is fair. But to the extent that it starts dropping into that 60% range, then you might think about some more aggressive actions. But while you can, developing some reserves to navigate those difficult times. And then, of course, a policy that adds some additional governance to look at this perhaps on an annual basis. Any disclosures, putting your valuations on your website. They are readily available through CalPERS, but different things that you can do for governance. Some of the tools that you have are to make those additional discretionary payments on top of your required contributions. And you can either focus them on near-term savings or long-term savings. Again, something that we can model and help your staff. You can restructure your UAL payment if there are peaks that you're trying to avoid. But having some sort of volatility reserve to me is sort of priority number one. As a longtime finance director, is to have some reserves, whether it's internally or whether it's held externally through a Section 115 plan. Having a buffer against downturns or gyrations in the markets is very important. And then, of course, maybe thinking about once you've done that deep dive to codify that in some sort of funding policy or reserve policy, and that's also something I can help your staff with. But it's longer than I intended, but that's roughly, or at the end of the presentation. You can consider making additional discretionary payments to PERS, and perhaps a balanced approach of setting some funds aside at the same time to develop some sort of a volatility reserve, whether that is held internally or externally in a trust, and that is something that the agency, it's really a personal decision whether you want to keep it internal or externally in the trust. The pension policy development just codifies the management goals. It helps demonstrate that that you intend to fulfill that promise, both is showing that you have long-term discipline, reassures creditors, staff, and stakeholders that you're committed to funding that liability, provides a roadmap for future committee members and council members, and helps transparency in governance. That'll take any further questions that you may have from the committee.
You want to go ahead, Mark?
I definitely have questions. Is it?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. So I guess the first question is there a report that goes with this, or is sort of this PowerPoint and presentation the extent of the scope of services right now?
So I'm available. I mean, so from GovInvest, we prepare an active model where you can model what a contribution might look like, what your reserves may be, where your costs may be headed under different scenarios, and that is all generated through the software and modeling your specific employees. I'm available at your disposal for advisory consulting. You receive from CalPERS evaluation report for the 21 Dow, and you'll be receiving another 60-page report on your 22. I don't typically regenerate something that they already prepare, but help you interpret what you receive already from CalPERS. So a long way, the answer is not typically, but if there's something that you're looking for, I'm happy to consider that, see if there's something I can help with.
And I have a copy of the slides that will be made available. We'll put them up where all the agenda stuff is after this meeting.
Yeah, I guess part of what I'm thinking about is that for planning purposes, the actual numbers on this particular graph would be helpful to have. So I guess I was thinking if there was a report, there may be a table that actually has numbers, but maybe the software, it would fall out of the software or something. Are we able to run the software? Do you run the software? How, if we want to stress test things ourselves, how does that work?
Staff does have access to the software. Typically, there are a number of, say, probably 98 or 99% of our clients just ask us to run those stress tests for us. But we're happy to follow Heather's lead on either training staff or actually just generating whatever stress tests that you deem appropriate. But it is a live model. So I think what we're trying to accomplish, CalPERS gives you a very long static report. This is a dynamic model that you can play with assumptions and help make projections so that you're not following this red curve line is what's shown in the written report from CalPERS. And what we've given you is a model to say this is where your costs are likely to head under these circumstances.
I am more than willing to sit down with any of you or do a call where I bring up the software and put in any assumptions you guys want to look at, if that's something that you're interested in.
And I'm happy to join that call as well and run the numbers, or unload. To your point, graphs are nice, but for the finance team, we always like to look at numbers. So any of the numbers that are in the software can be are downloadable, so you can see the specifics on what your UAL, what your accrued liability is, what your market value of assets are projected to be, your unfunded liability, what your normal costs. There's probably a good 50 different metrics that you could download for a 30-year period of time.
Okay, one more, sorry. I know we're short on time. I guess where we're going, I think, is that we're going to want a policy regarding pensions, funding, and so forth. And it sounds like you guys can give advice on that. So I guess that's something for us to consider, because that's kind of what we were already going towards, is some kind of policy like that. So, okay.
I do have a follow-on question. So it's kind of a two-part question. So the first part of the question is, if you could let us know, over the last 20, 30 years, how many times has CalPERS adjusted the discount rate? And then secondly, now that they've adjusted it downward to 6.8%, do you think that's sufficient? And what do you think the likelihood is that they will have to decrease it further?
Well, so, the good and bad about Treasury rates or the increased rates the Fed funds rates, and it was increased another 0.25% today. That should bring over time some stability to all pension funds' ability to achieve their rate of return. So a balanced portfolio is typically 60% equities and 40% fixed income. And if now even a six-month treasury is earning nearly 5%, much easier to hit the assumed rate of return of 6.8%. And in that 4-year cycle, I'm mixed. I think what they will do if the bar is easier, and then next year for 4-year cycle, I suspect that what they will do, rather than to lower the discount rate or increase the discount rate further, if the capital market assumptions still support a growth environment, that they may take some of the risk out of the portfolio, so that there is less volatility and more stability for employer rates. That is only a personal opinion. In 4 years, we'll have to see where they go.
They also, the CalPERS board has a policy that if a return in any given year exceeds a certain threshold, they do an analysis to potentially lower the discount rate. That actually happened when they hit that 18% return, but there was a huge lash from all the cities that were saying, hey, our rates are already going up because you've just recently lowered the discount rate. We cannot have you continue to do that. And so they didn't actually act on that in that year.
So CalPERS is...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just trying to interpret what Heather said. So CalPERS, it sounds like, is aware that their discount rate has been too high, and so in years when they significantly outperform the discount rate, they're actually taking advantage of that by lowering it a little bit. Is that what you're saying, Heather?
Heather, if I could jump in there. Yes, so there was a policy set by then Chief Actuary Alan Milligan called a risk mitigation policy, and I can send you a link to that policy. But it basically set up specific thresholds. So if they had excess returns above certain amounts, then his intent was to lower, to take some of that excess earnings to offset a lower discount rate that theoretically would reduce the risk in the portfolio, and therefore it being a risk mitigation policy. This last go around, they actually lowered it because of the risk mitigation policy. The capital market assumptions really suggested that they should lower even further, and what they opted to do is not lower any further than what the risk mitigation policy. That there was that backlash that Heather suggested, to say lowering it beyond 6.8% would just be too painful. So that's when they pushed back and said, go out, investment team, figure out a way, come up with an investment allocation that would essentially they took on more risk to support a return of 6.8%. To mitigate, otherwise the capital market assumption at the time suggested that they could only earn a rate of about 6.1, 6.2%, and that was too much. But that policy is still in place. There's no sunset date to that policy and no practical floor. So in a year of excessive returns, even before the 4-year cycle, that policy could come at play, and it is possible that the board could consider a further drop.
What was the name of that policy again? You said you might be able to send us a link.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I can send that to. It's the risk mitigation policy.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have questions?
Yeah, I have a question, if you go to slide 19. Yeah, so I understand this is a distribution of agencies and where they stand in funding. It looks like Albany is above the average slightly. Is that just the average across the agencies, or is it the average of like CalPERS as a whole? I'm basically asking this to understand if you actually look at where we compare to the other agencies, it looks like there are many agencies that are well above us in their funding status, and we'd actually be in like the bottom quartile.
So one of the things that you really can't see in here is that particularly in 21 and some in 22, a lot of agencies issued what are called pension obligation bonds, and all the proceeds from the issuance of those bonds are reflected in the assets, but those liabilities aren't reflected anywhere on this chart. So there was a lot of money that poured in. And in some cases, the average agency started to fall below as a result, because there were hundreds of millions of dollars that were poured into the system, and that debt is not reflected in here. There are agencies that are at or above 100%. Some of it have done so because they've had surpluses. You know, a lot of water districts have typically in a position to add a lot of cash into the system. There are also cities that borrowed a ton of money and have put that money into the system and subsequently took losses as well.
Maybe to follow up, but fundamentally, I'm thinking that the comparison of the total with Albany is based on a dollar comparison, like the total dollars that are in CalPERS is kind of an average weighted 70% funded ratio, right? But then when you look at the bars above, it's actually the count of the agencies. And so while on a dollar basis, we're kind of like similar to the average, but when you look at our counts, we're in the bottom 1/3 or 1/4 or something like that. I think, is that what you were asking, Kyle?
Yeah, more or less.
So,
Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, this is also, when you look at the count, sometimes it's misleading. I was looking at the state actuary report recently, and I was trying to say, okay, why are the top two agencies, the ones that are ranked number one, they have, you know, very little financial risk. Why is that? And some of them have, you know, like bare bones pensions. So they might not necessarily offer the same benefits. So it's hard when you're looking at the number of agencies and you're not necessarily comparing the plans themselves. Does that sort of make sense, Dan?
It does. You have to remember a lot of these agencies only have miscellaneous employees, and the safety plans have richer benefits and have more volatility. So for a miscellaneous plan to get closer to 100%, much easier task than an agency that also has safety as well.
Gotcha. So a lot of that green may not be good for comparison purposes.
It's all. I found as a finance director, it's always difficult to make comparisons. But I think in kind of law of large numbers, you're seeing yourself kind of around the average funded status. I think which is a good thing. Slipping below, anything getting near 50% is a real danger zone of not being able to pull up. So to have a fairly substantial loss and still be in the 70% range is still good. The city has work ahead to get to a fully funded status. If CalPERS can earn 6.8%, it will theoretically self-correct and bring you to fully funded status over a 20-year period of time. And you would expect, as I said, anywhere between a 1 to almost a 2.5% improvement just by making your UAL payment each year. So it will, and given your accrued liability of roughly 144 million, you're about 1.4 million, for every $1.4 million increases your funded status about 1%.
Got it.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Could you explain who GovInvest is and what was your relationship? I mean, are you a consultant? Because literally, I was just presented with this presentation, but I don't really know who you are. Are you well, let me give you a bunch of questions so that they can answer them all. Are you a consultant hired by the city? And if so, what was your goal? Was it are you going to be advising us? Are you going to be presenting to the council? Or do you just present to the finance director? Have you done this before for the city of Albany? And if you have, how often have you done it? So, I mean, have you been doing this year over year, or is this just like a one-off? And I would like, you gave us a graph from CalPERS about how we compare with other agencies, and it became clear that the agencies in the green were irrelevant because they were like water districts. So we want to know how we compare to Berkeley, El Cerrito, and there was a slide I thought that had that, but Berkeley in particular, because I thought that, they have a particular problem with this issue.
Certainly, the statistics are public, and I can provide funded status of of virtually any agency that is out there. So if there are a number of agencies that you would like a comparison to, relay that to Heather, and I can get their funded status. GovInvest started out as a software company, really introducing technology. As I was a former customer, I was a former finance director and treasurer for the city of Newport Beach, and finance directors are handed a evaluation for each of their plans. There may be 2 to as many as 6 different plans. They're 60-page reports. It was at a picture point of time. Very difficult to make projections forward. GovInvest came about, through some entrepreneurs that said, okay, let's really kind of bring the actuarial valuation process out of the dark ages, and rather it be just a static report, that it's an active software model that can be used to project. I am a consultant that comes along with the software, having been in Heather's shoes, managing both not only the committee and the public process of describing these, but I have spent a very long time really diving deep into this pension problem. Since my retirement, GovInvest, it has actuaries on staff, so I work very closely with them, and we share expertise of both prior finance directors and actuaries to help explain the number of moving parts, and hopefully move from kind of analysis paralysis to actually funding policies and actionable decisions. So how long, not being really on the sales and contracting side, I'm not sure how long Albany has been a customer of GovInvest. This is my first committee presentation, but I met with Heather a couple times throughout the year. Our plan would be to for every year that the agency is engaged with the county is to really meet with city staff at least once a quarter to let us know. I'm on a first name basis with many of the actuaries at CalPERS, trading texts back and forth about any changes. So it's one of those areas that's inch wide and a mile deep, and this is something we can take off of some of the finance directors' many duties to help advise in a very specialty area and actually provide assistance and not cause Heather more time training me in some of the areas that she otherwise may need help.
The city has had the GovInvest software since before I started, so at least 6 or 7 years. But I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, it's fairly recent that you guys have delved a little bit deeper into the actuarial. You've done our GASB, our OPEB reports for a little while, and you just recently did, I think, the closed police and fire pension actuarial valuation, the GASB 67 and 68. So yeah, they've worked with us for a while, but I think we're just recently expanding the staff and the presentation aspect of it.
So they're not really advisors, but a software developer that allows you to give you good information. I mean, this is Heather, right? I mean, I'm hoping you think that this has helped you understand, because it's a software that you can then manipulate and then help us make decisions. But they're just so if they're not really people that we go to, because I was looking for, well, here is our executive report at the end where we advise A, B, C, and D. That's not their role. Their role is simply to run, to give an overview and not advise.
GovInvest can help, if we can help say, here are some options and here are, what those options potentially could do for you. I'm not sure we would find very many takers for someone to tell us which one to do, because of how large these numbers are. Most consultants would just say, here are the options. You guys need to choose which one is best for you. And I think that.
Right, Heather, so can we show up that last slide, or one of the last slides that shows what are the different options to dealing with it? The circles.
And certainly we are, it's what I do for probably 100, I think we have 300 clients in California. And so we do provide advisory services, but ultimately, how you use these tools, some of which, we would work hand in hand in saying, okay, these are levers that you can pull, and here's some suggestions. But ultimately, even as an advisory committee, the council ultimately makes the final decision on. So Heather and I are more than happy to provide recommendations. But this first step was intended to introduce some of these issues and tools that you can to mitigate the liability. And this was more or less a framework that you might want to think about. Is first, as I said, my recommendation, and if you were looking to me, today, is to the policy, absolutely, you start defining what's an appropriate reserve level that's appropriate for your liability and your community. Look at your solvency numbers and set up trigger points of how you might fund it. When you've got both of those really established, start looking at means to shave off some interest earnings on how you can actually reduce the costs. And those are all areas we can help, but we try to start, we recognize that this is a very complex and dense topic that we need to really take in bite-sized pieces so you're not overwhelmed. But absolutely, we can help you get to actionable decisions.
Thank you. You answered that well.
Great. Does anybody have any other questions? That was really helpful. Thank you very much for presenting to us. Gives us a lot of points to take off from and discussion points.
You're very welcome. And to the extent that you have follow-up questions, or there are areas that I fell short that it would be helpful to infill, like some of those comparisons, feel free to filter them through Heather, and we want to provide as much service to the city as possible.
I think that we do need to ask for public comment in case there's anything. There's Mr. Bone from the audience has a comment.
Thank you very much. Dan, if you're still there, slide 8, year 2017.
Slide, I'm sorry, am I on the right slide? I couldn't quite hear what slide.
Yes, I'm sorry. Slide 8, it would be the historical factors impacting funded status. My question specifically is year 2017. It looks like you are indicating that an additional $6 billion was contributed from the state of California. And my question would be, we're a local agency participating in CalPERS, but there are also state agencies participating in CalPERS. And I think I know the answer, but I have a feeling the $6 billion was not any real benefit to the city of Albany specifically. I can't imagine our UAL went down. Maybe perhaps some of this $6 billion feeds into maybe a contribution rate lowering slightly, but I'm thinking no.
That's correct. That was the governor infusing money into the state plan, so they did not benefit local agencies.
So there's no white knight for the city of Albany on that one.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Is there any other public comment? Okay, I think that wraps this up for us then. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to give us this presentation.
Absolutely. Very well.
Okay, so I would like to just do a quick time check. We are at 8:19, and we have several items on the agenda that we need to get through. I had sketched out a sort of a guideline for where I hoped we would be at this point so that we leave enough time for the remainder of the agenda items. The next item that's up on the agenda is the Pension Subcommittee update. So perhaps we can get through this in maybe 15 minutes. Do you think that's possible? So this would be item 6-1, Pension Subcommittee update. Mark and I met about a month ago to discuss items to suggest to council, and we submitted a memo which is attached to the agenda. So I think we should go through that memo, and maybe Mark, if you would want to lead us through that memo and see if we can get through the discussion on that.
Sure. I guess the way I think of this is like the beginnings of a policy, right? Along the lines of what he was saying, kind of recommending that the city have a pension policy. These are maybe some initial thoughts about what might go into that policy. And so the first thing is, of course, the goals, which are, I think, are in complete sync with what Dan talked about. First of all, of course, meeting all the pension obligations, and of course, affordability and reducing volatility for the city. As far as the recommendations go, the first thing is just making sure that the funding, what he was calling the normal cost, is reasonable. So for example, if we're funding current employees, assuming a 6.8 discount rate, for example, but CalPERS maybe really, there sounds like maybe there was some pressure to keep it at 6.8%. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, maybe that's not the right rate. That's what CalPERS is allowing us to fund at. But we want to fund at a number that's not going to get us behind in the future. So the idea is to just give some thought as to what appropriate discount rate would be, regardless of what CalPERS is telling us we can fund at. The second thing is about a funding goal. We're at 70%. I would suggest that, Kim and I were talking, maybe it would be appropriate or it would be nice to have a goal of having it at 80% or between 80 and 100% and having some consequences in terms of funding and things if it drops below 80%. So again, these are just sort of outlines of things that may go into a policy, and I would love advice from you all and the public and GovInvest potentially about what appropriate numbers would be. Obviously, there's a lot of other assumptions in the actuarial model, so we would want to make sure that we, again, not just rely on CalPERS assumptions, but use ones that we think are appropriately conservative. The cash flow, in terms of, again, I think this is in sync with what Dan was saying, this is a long-term issue. It doesn't have to be, if we let's say have a goal of being funded at 80%, we don't have to do that next year or in 2 years. So the question is, like, how do we get there in a way that the city can reasonably budget for and keep the cash flow needs of the city reasonable. And then the last thing, or the second to last thing, number 5, is benchmarks. We talk a lot about the funding ratio, in other words, of the total liabilities, how much assets are there, but there's a lot of other ways to look at the health of a pension fund. So for example, perfect example, when we were talking about those bars with the green line, the green bars and the other bars, if a fund is very unfunded or low funded, but it's a very tiny fund on a very big base, a very big population or a very big budget, it's not a problem. So the question is, like, what's the unfunded liability in relation to the population or in relation to the budget? Other types of ways of looking at things rather than just the funding ratio. Again, we were just kind of like bouncing ideas around, and this is the kind of thing that would eventually go into a policy. And then again, just sort of reiterated the funding policy. So that's really all I was prepared to talk about. I think it's going to need a lot of input from you all and the public and others about really filling in the numbers. But that's kind of where we were going. How was that? Is that all right?
That was great.
Okay.
And with respect to the funding policy, one of the things that Dan mentioned from GovInvest was that they are available to help us craft a funding policy. So I think they probably could provide more advisory services or more support to us than they currently are doing if we decided to try to use them in that capacity.
So I guess the real question, one real question is, just like we are going to review later in the agenda, the investment policy and the general reserve, the general fund reserve policy, do we want to go in the direction of having a policy like that for pension?
I think that we do. I think that it's incumbent that we add that. There are others that, when we get to that point in the agenda, that I think are worthy of discussion and consideration, but certainly a funding policy. I just had a couple questions, Mark, on the presentation.
Yeah.
Sketch that you did, and these are, from my point of view, is not really understanding this stuff real well at all. But when you say that we need to protect the, well, in the slides that were presented in the deck, we're talking about liquidity. Are you talking about the same, you're just using different terminology? Instead of liquidity, you're saying
Cash flow. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yes.
so that means the same thing to you?
Yeah.
Because when I saw the slide, the bubble slide with all of the different, that to me is the policy. That is the policy, and that, just that picture, which is very useful to my thinking, would be the way we would want to structure a policy. So as long as we're talking about the same thing, then.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think that funding policy is going to trigger different levels of funding and different actions for different plans, right? The single employer plan is differently situated than the fire and police plans, and those are differently situated from the PEPRA plans.
Okay.
So I sort of feel like there are 3 buckets of pension plans that we have issues with. There's the closed plan, which really we're going to be on a pay-as-you-go regimen with that one soon, if not immediately. I'm not sure. But pretty soon, that's a pay-as-you-go plan. And then some of the other plans, like the fire and the older fire and police plans, have a lower funding percentage number. So that's going to trigger different funding for those. And then the PEPRA plans, relatively speaking, have a higher funding percentage, and we're in a little bit better shape on those. But I think the funding policy can set those triggers about liquidity and funding ratios and all those things, and will help us to decide what has to be funded when. But I think that that's the roadmap, right, is to have a policy like that, similar to how we're developing an investment policy, and we need a coherent capital reserve policy. All of these things, we have to have the roadmap for what needs to happen.
Would the policy also anticipate a confrontational relationship between municipalities and CalPERS? In the council meeting on Monday, Councilmember Jordan referenced his idea that at some point in time there's going to be a showdown between a game of chicken, I think was his exact quote, between CalPERS and municipalities who just can't make this. So I'm thinking that potentially is something that could be referenced in a policy as well. Not how do we play the game of chicken, but the fact that we are in a situation, we could potentially find ourselves in a situation of insolvency because of CalPERS, and what do we do and how do we respond in that way. So I would like to see that as possibly part of the policy as well. Yeah, that's all.
Other comments on this?
How would you describe this policy versus having a 5-year plan? Because my perception was, from presentations that you had, was that over the next 5 years, things were going to get worse. And so, I mean, a policy sounds like, well, we would like to do this and we'd like to do that, versus actually having a plan that says, here's a way to get from A to B, and you have a goal, whether it's the 80% or, and then and with the help with, I mean, that's what I thought we were going toward. And my question is really for Heather, is that are you prepared to work with this subcommittee to come up with I would say a plan, not a policy, a 5-year plan? And I would like us to define whether, I mean, I just made up that number. Do you want to say 7-year plan, and have a deadline in the sense like, well, by the end of, this year, or that we have a plan that we submit to the council to advise them how to address over a certain period of time the unfunded actuarial pension liability.
Can I jump in? I know maybe you asked Heather, but I'll just jump in. Why I think of it as a policy rather than a plan is because, as we've seen over the last 2 years, the status of the plans can vary enormously. Just 1 year of great returns, 1 year of terrible returns. And so we can make the best 5-year plan, but then 2 years of terrible returns and the plan is crap. Or 2 years of great returns and it's irrelevant, right? So to me, I was thinking of it as a policy that can adjust and trigger action as the situation changes, because I don't think any of us know what the next 5 years will look like.
And I think I could jump in just a little bit here, too. My view is that we set policy so that staff can enact plans. And that's kind of civics 101 idea, that you can't have a plan unless you have a policy.
The policy is the guideline.
Yeah, yeah,
It gives you the benchmarks, and then the plan comes out of that. And so we think we know what the plan is right now, but we don't know what the investment returns will be and what these, I thought it was interesting how the demographic factors played in, and I too was wondering if that meant COVID had an impact and there was more earlier mortality than the plan had assumed, and then the plan got a benefit from that. But if we have a policy that says if your funding ratio goes below X and if your liquidity or your solvency of the plan, diminishes, then more contributions are called for. Conversely, if those things go in the positive direction, then we don't need to make those extra contributions. And so I think to a certain extent, our hands are tied, right? Because there are going to be these UAL payments that we have to make in addition to our employee and employer contributions. And we have to make the UAL payments, and that's what we have to do. But then in years where we have a surplus, how much more of that surplus do we want to put towards the pension versus the capital reserve or other things? And I think that's where the policy can help us, because there will be times when there is going to be extra that we could put towards it. And then there's also the pension reserve fund that's going to come up on one of the next agenda items. So, and part of the policy, I think, would be, do we hold extra contributions in our pension reserve fund, which is really just sort of a designated portion of our general fund, or do we actually contribute it? Because if we hold it in our reserve fund, then that gives us a little bit more flexibility based on the policy and the funding ratio and the liquidity and all these other factors of, we're in trouble because the plan underperformed the benchmark this year, so we're going to need to put more in. Then we could use that pension reserve to smooth that out a little bit for us. So, yeah. So these are all just things that play into that.
Yeah.
So I guess
I'm waiting
the
for,
next-
can I get some input from Heather? And you're not here, Heather, so I can't see your face or see you react to any of this stuff. So as the finance director, can you give us some input about how you see this in the future? And have you had, you work with the city administrator to city manager about this?
Yeah, pensions are obviously a high priority for us. And so they're definitely on our radar and something that we talk about often, especially with the increasing UAL payments. One thing, I think this is a much larger conversation if we want to put a policy in place. One thing that you want to think about is, obviously, if the policy says 80%, we're not there, right? So similar to the general fund reserve policy where it says, okay, if you don't have your 25%, how are you going to get back there? You need to make sure that if you authorize it to go below that 25%, you have a plan in place to bring it back up to 25% in, I think it says 3 years. It might say 5. So what would that same kind of mechanism be in the pension policy? Because you don't want to have a policy that just says, don't do this, and then not say, if it happens, then what? So I think this is a much bigger conversation. And I think that we also need to recognize that this is not, the only thing that the city is looking at right now for where to spend money. And, we have the budget discussion coming up, and we're currently budgeting a deficit. So, there's a lot of different things that need to kind of all work together. Those are my thoughts.
So where do we want to leave this topic? I imagine Mark and I, we should meet again and decide how to move forward. And I'm imagining that looks like maybe trying to do some modeling with the GovInvest software and thinking about some of the outline of what a funding policy might look like that we could bring back to this body and discuss some more, meet with Heather, obviously. So
Yeah, I agree.
is there
I
any more?
do plan to have the pension subcommittee memo attached to the biennial budget package, so that the council can see that this is obviously something that you guys are actively working on and is important. So I don't know, maybe you want to also suggest at the study session that, I say in my information about policies that in the fall, I'll bring back a debt service policy. It might be something that you guys want to suggest to the council that a pension policy be something that we look into as well.
Yes. And I think now, if we don't have any more comments from the committee, we need to take public comment. Okay, no public comment. So let me move back to the agenda. Right, the next item on the agenda is 6-2, fiscal years 2023-24, 24-25 policy review. So that's you, Heather, right?
I was just going to say, I suppose that's me. Okay. Let me pull up my, and nobody else wants to go? Okay. All right, so in the staff report, there are 3 policies that the council has adopted and we are looking to make changes to. Well, we're not suggesting any changes to the general fund reserve policy. There is a very detailed analysis in my staff report about the general fund reserve policy using the Government Finance Officer Association's recommended format. There's an Excel spreadsheet. We rank different categories, and it kind of gives you an idea of where they think that you should land in your fund balance reserves. And I put in my staff report, it is pretty jarring, the difference in what one organization recommends as a minimum reserve and what another organization recommends as a minimum reserve. The state auditor's report is something that, we've talked about often. And when you look into it, they're saying you should have at least 75% of a fund balance reserve for your general fund. Now, the Government Finance Officers Association recommends 16.6%. That's a huge discrepancy. And so doing the actual detailed analysis helps kind of put us into a place where, yeah, I think that the 25% is still, the correct place to be. And I won't go through these in detail, but the information that the Government Finance Officers Association spreadsheet uses are vulnerability to extreme events, revenue source stability, expenditure volatility, leverage, which is, your debt service, liquidity, how much cash do you have, dependency on other funds, or dependency of other funds on the general fund, and growth and capital projects. So I did make some changes to different categories year over year, but in the end, we still have a total of 24, which puts us in the Government Finance Officer Association's suggested 17 to 25%. And so I'm not suggesting any changes to the 25% from when the policy was originally passed. I do put in, I double checked these, only one of these had been updated since the last time we did this, and it was Richmond's. Richmond's actually increased. I think before it was really low, and now they are suggesting that they have a 15 to 20% fund balance policy, but they have like a goal of 2025 or something before they get there. Emeryville has a 50%. I had talked to their finance director when we originally were putting this policy together, and the reason theirs is 50% is because they are very heavily reliant on sales taxes. And so because they have that, one major funding source, they are very vulnerable to economic downturns. So that's why theirs is so high. Sorry, my cat stepped on the computer. Wasn't the baby this time. Okay. So the next policy is the investment policy, and there are several changes that are being suggested. We have a representative from the PFMAM, the new asset management investment manager firm that suggested a lot of these changes. So if you have questions, we can bring her in. But most of them are to bring us in line with updates to state policy. It loosens up a little, a handful of the items, but there's nothing earth-shattering. And then the capital reserve fund policy. Ooh,
Can
yeah.
I stop you for a minute on the investment policy? I
Of
saw
course.
something in there about asset-backed securities, and it made me cringe, and I wanted to ask what that was.
I will bring in, let me.
I'd add
see if I can-
repurchase agreements to that, too.
Yeah, these things
Cassie,
bring
can
back
you-
real bad memories of past meltdowns.
Cassie, can you allow her to talk? I don't know why I'm. There we go. Okay, Monique, you should be, there we go.
Hi, good afternoon, or good evening, actually, everyone. Pleasure to meet you. I'm Monique Spike. I serve as the city's liaison to PFM Asset Management, which serves as the city's investment advisor. The asset-backed securities that we're recommending in the city's policy are not the same asset-backed securities that essentially crashed the financial markets back in 2007, 2008. So I want to first and foremost assure you of that. The asset-backed securities that we are considering here are types of securities that are backed by certain assets. Those assets include things like equipment leases, credit card receivables, auto leases, etc. PFM Asset Management has a very stringent policy for allowing asset-backed securities. Not only do we review the overall programs that we approve for our clients, but we also approve the underlying collateral types and underwriting requirements of those programs as well. So we're very comfortable and confident with the asset-backed securities we have here. I do want to confirm that all of the asset-backed security types that we invest in are securitized in many different ways, including having additional collateral pools, reserve requirements, etc. And we have a separate asset-backed security committee to review these asset classes. These types are allowed by the California Government Code, which oversees investments for agencies like yourself, and we will restrict this to a percentage of the overall portfolio. With regard to repurchase agreements are an investment type that is also allowed by the California Government Code. The city's investment policy did already allow repurchase agreements to be utilized. We recommended adding some additional language to clarify and confirm that the market value of the securities that underlie the repo should be at least 102% of the funds that the repo is related to. And we also added some compliance guidelines to those margin requirements for repurchase agreements.
Is there any limit on the repurchase agreements as a percentage of the investment portfolio?
There are no limits on the repurchase agreement language in the city's policy. The repurchase agreement term that you have here does not allow for you to invest in certain types of repo. The California Government Code is very specific about the type of repurchase agreements that are allowed as well. Generally, the goal is that any repo that you invest in would ideally be bankruptcy remote, meaning it would be the type of repurchase agreement that is defined in the bankruptcy code. However, we typically do not invest in repurchase agreements on our clients' behalf, so it'd be unlikely that we'd see this investment type in the near future.
And why don't you currently invest in repurchase agreements?
Repurchase agreements are typically used as a liquidity tool. For an account of your size, there are better liquidity options available. For some of our larger clients, for example, we at PFM Asset Management manage a government investment pool, similar in style to LAIF, but not necessarily the same. And for that pool, because it's about $15 billion, we do use repo. For your portfolio, there are other liquidity vehicles that we can use, such as CAM, for example, that are more appropriate.
Anybody else have any other questions on the investments?
I just had a quick question. On some of the investments, it seemed like, you had to have minimum rating in order to invest in them, but I might have missed it. I didn't see that on like municipal bonds or like the ratings of banks if we were to buy CDs.
Yeah, that's a great question. The goal in drafting the policy was to mimic the California Government Code in places where appropriate. And the California Government Code does not specify a rating category for municipal bonds and a rating category for other types of debt. There are some investments, however, that we do have minimum ratings for that we purchase. Generally, we're not purchasing any corporate investment with a rating below the A category by at least one statistical rating association, such as Moody's, S&P, or Fitch. But really it's because the California Government Code as written doesn't necessarily specify rating requirements for each sector.
But would we as a city want to restrict ourselves, even if the government code doesn't require it, to less risky muni bonds or whatever? I mean, I guess that's the question.
The way we look at municipal bonds for PFM asset management, we have additional credit criteria for the securities and asset types that we purchase on our clients' behalf. And so in general, we look at municipal bonds in certain ways. We look at the credit rating, the underlying fundamentals, the market liquidity of the investment type, and also seek to diversify as well by issuer within that sector. So we do have internal guidelines for credit for municipal bonds, for negotiable CDs, other credit instruments, and other asset types.
And I think it's also important to note that it's all going to go back to, is it the prudent investor or whatever we have to, we're both PFM Asset Management and myself are fiduciaries in, in the city's assets. And so we are not going to put the city in something that we think is going to be very risky.
Okay.
Okay, I kind of share your thought on that. Why not codify that if we don't plan to invest in anything that is very risky? Is there a downside to saying that we wouldn't invest in a municipal bond that has a rating lower than A, for example? Do you feel like that in some way limits the?
Yes, if the question is, would that limit us in any way?
Yeah.
I don't think at this time, if we added, for example, investments in the city's portfolio, if so rated, would have to have a minimum rating in the A category by at least one NRSRO, would limit us unnecessarily, no.
For my 2 cents, I would add it then if it's not a limiting factor.
And I'd just chime in that I know we're not taking a vote on this, but I think it's a good idea as well, so I would like to see it.
Okay. Does any other questions on the investments?
Well,
Okay,
I had a question on the previous one. I mean,
On the
fund, general fund. It seems that I'm looking for the statement here. We're planning on funding the deficit from the general fund? Is that correct?
Yes.
If I can stop you for just 1 second, I think maybe we can let Monique go at this point because we're done with the investment questions.
Okay.
Unless do we have to take public comment on the speaker who's attending?
Sure.
Is there any public comment? No. Okay, I think we could let Monique go then, and then go on to Francesca's question.
Yeah, so the plan is to fund the deficit
Thank you.
from our reserves and still maintain our 25%. So how does that work? I mean, so
We currently have more than 25%, so we can fund that deficit and have the 25%.
I did a little spreadsheet on this because I was curious. And I think our general reserve balance, general fund reserve balance at 6/30/22 is about 10.7 million. Is that correct?
Approximate, yeah.
Okay. So if the reserve is targeted at 25% of approved annual operating expenses. And if we have $31 million of approved, well, proposed operating expenses for the coming fiscal year, then our targeted general fund reserve would be 7.7 million, and we have 10.7 million currently. The deficit that's budgeted would be 2.5 million. So for 1 year, we could make this work because the general fund reserve balance would be at about 8.2, even accounting for that 2.5 million budgeted deficit. But this was a point I was going to bring up later. We can't do it for 2 years, and we're budgeting deficits here for 2 years. We're budgeting about 6.1 million of combined deficits. So that would take the general reserve fund balance down to only 4.5 million as of June 30, 25. So we could do it for 1 year, but not 2.
Correct.
So what's the plan then? I mean, this is a biennial budget, and so it seems like we just punt, the goal is to just punt, okay? We have a deficit, we just take the money from our
I
savings
think
to
we're
cover it.
getting off of the current agenda topic and moving on to the next one, so
Yeah,
can we
maybe we
refocus?
Maybe we just
Okay.
finish the policy review first, and then the very next topic is the budget review, and I think we're gonna go into detail on that.
I just, since Francesca's taken us back this one, there's a quick question that I have, or a quick comment that I have actually about the ratings, Heather, that you assigned. You assigned growth, which was number 7 on the screen in front of us. You assigned it unimportant and referenced Albany's relatively small footprint. But in fact, growth is happening in our community. I can think back 30 years ago, the number of FTEs that worked for the city, and it was considerably less than now. We have a large number of people who are going to be moving in when the project over behind Sprouts is finished and the graduate students move in. So we are growing. The footprint might not change, but we're getting taller. So I think that would bring our total, even if it were only in neutral, it would bring it up to 25, and it just supports the final decision that you made anyway. But I just wanted to make that comment. Thanks.
I completely agree with that, and just in terms of, and I thought it was really striking, the 16% to 75% difference in the recommendation for general fund balances. When you think about city government having 3 months of operating expenses on hand, if something catastrophic happens, like an earthquake or flooding, that's really not very much. And a city isn't able to be nimble and flexible in the way that maybe a private company could be. We don't have the ability to sell off assets and lay off half of the staff and dispense with our pension obligations. We have to pay all these things. They're pretty much fixed costs, a lot of this. So I think that arguably it leads me in the direction of thinking it should be more than 25%, ultimately.
I agree. I mean, we're moving, and actually Heather mentioned that there's 2 different kinds of percentages, and one the state wanted 75%, which seems
Crazy high.
crazy, yes. But I agree we should be moving to the other direction, not going down, but going up in our reserve percentage.
Just for point of conversation, what is the GFOA recommended rate if you actually have a score of 25 or more? Seems like they're in buckets. What's the next bucket?
That is going to take me a minute. Give me 1 second. Someone else have a question while I'm finding that information? Of course not. Okay.
No.
You're testing me. And fund balance policy, 2023, GFOA risk analysis. Whoop, oh, you all get to see it. Amount reserved significantly higher than the GFOA recommended minimum, 26 to 35%. Consider a short informal benchmarking survey.
Yeah, so that put you, if you were at 33%, that would be 4 months, right? Reserve, which is kind of right in that range. So it's borderline.
I never thought of, I'm so glad that you gave actually a time frame. I'd never thought of it that way. You know, it was just a number, but you made it into something very real.
No money is coming in.
Yeah, like
long
we've
can
all
you
been there.
operate?
That's right. I only have 3 months' mortgage payments in the bank.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions on the, or Heather, did you have more? I guess you needed to still go through a couple of the other policies, right?
Yeah, there was one more policy that I was gonna, the capital reserve fund policy. Staff have worked on expanding this a little bit. When it was originally passed in 2020, it kind of established the policies and set us up in a framework from which to, move forward. And since the implementation of the policy, we're figuring out how to use them effectively as a planning tool and as, a budgeting tool. And so we are suggesting the addition of 3. 2 of them are already established, but just need to be kind of memorialized. The Climate Action and Adaptation Reserve Fund. This is directly related to the increase in the utility users taxes. While that is general fund money, the voters did suggest that, or encourage the council to use the increase, or use 1/3 of the increase for sustainability projects. And so, and the council has been very on top of that. So staff are suggesting to add that in years that there is a budget surplus, to add, to move the 1/3 increase into this reserve fund. It would be used for offsetting, capital expenditures for, electronic vehicles or any other updates that, the sustainability purchase is more expensive than the non-sustainable version, or it can be used for the climate action and adaptation plan projects, things like that. But it is still general fund money and can be reallocated at any time if needed. The new plan or fund is the pension reserve fund. Staff are suggesting that we move, or council allocated this on Monday night, but we're putting into the policy the pension reserve fund, and this will be a holding fund for different for use for pension, and how we use that is, could be up to the policy that, you guys are looking at, or if we needed to offset, you'll see in the budget proposal next, staff are suggesting using a portion of this to offset the increase in the UAL for next year. However, we're also suggesting to, Mark had suggested that we make don't just use what CalPERS says, and, use our own judgment to determine what our rate should be. In the and again, we'll talk about this next, but in the biennial budget proposal, staff increased the rate for current contributions by 0.5%. So 0.5% additional contribution on current salaries is being budgeted that would go into the pension reserve fund. Now, it's not a lot. It totals like $40,000, but it's something, and could potentially help with, make a small additional contribution, or, help offset a small amount in the future. So we're suggesting a pension reserve fund. And I'll stop talking.
on that?
Yeah, I have a couple comments. First of all, I think the addition of these 3 reserve funds is a great idea. But Heather, I wonder if in the policy itself, we shouldn't talk about how does an issue or a topic rise to the level of deserving a reserve fund. So I can envision a time when we might want to have an affordable housing reserve fund, when we might want to have a disaster relief reserve fund. I mean, there's a number of things that may pique the public's interest, and maybe the policy should talk about, well, how do they get there in the first place, and what are the steps that need to be followed in order for a reserve fund to be designated. That's just my suggestion.
Any other comments on this?
Do each of these have targets associated with them?
So they all have, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my button's not going up and down. Okay, so they all have minimum funding levels. And those minimum funding levels, as I described to council on Monday, were set as basically emergency amounts. So if a piece of equipment broke and we needed to fix it immediately, or, you know, and that was set department by department to determine, you know, what would your emergency need be. So each reserve fund has its own minimum funding level where it cannot drop below without a majority vote from the city council. The amount above the minimum funding level, staff uses to plan for asset repair and replacement, or, for example, in the community development reserve funds, the plans that, you know, the city general plan, the specific plans, and all of those that need to be updated, the housing element, they need to be updated, you know, every 5-10 years. And so the idea with the reserve funds is to eventually start funding them from the general fund operating budget when we're able to do that. But to even out the effects on the general fund of these larger purchases that don't happen every year. So the general fund would have a smooth increase or decrease or be the same when the reserve funds are spending, you know, 500,000, 500,000, 3 million, 500,000, 500. So, and you don't see that in your general fund operating budget, because those are real shocks that you can't really plan for. And so to have them in the reserve funds allows staff to better plan for those future expenditures.
Got it. That was helpful.
Any other comments or questions? Do we have any public comment on this? Okay, I think we need to move along because we're at 9:09 and we've got the budget, the biennial budget coming up as the next item, which I think is going to be a fairly lengthy one. So let's go ahead and move to the biennial budget review.
Suppose that's back to me again.
Yep.
Okay, so let me pull up. This is going to be a lot of little numbers. I am making them as big as I can. Okay, so the attachment that was presented for the budget includes the fiscal year 22 actuals, the approved budget for 2023, the year-to-date as of 4/21/23, where I estimate that we're going to end the year. Again, these are estimates. They will most likely change. Please do not hold me to this. And then the requests for 2024. Now, the department requests are put together based on staff's educated estimate for what the services that are being provided or that have been requested will cost. So we have broken out revenues, and you'll see that there is a fairly significant increase from the current budgeted revenues to the suggested revenues. And that is mostly due to the fact that we we budgeted very conservatively during COVID because we did not know what was going to happen. We are now coming out of the pandemic. We've seen property tax values. People have continued to pay their property taxes. That was one thing that was, not certain at the beginning of the pandemic. They have, continued to pay their property taxes. They have actually invested in their properties. So property values, the taxable value has increased significantly. So there was a large increase. It was like 6% from 22 to 23, and there's another 5.5% increase in the taxable property values from 23 to 24. That's the estimate that the county assessor put out recently. So staff have included those for property taxes. We also increased the sales tax projections to the number that our sales tax consultant, Avenue or Muni Services, has suggested. We had previously budgeted a little bit more conservative than their estimate because, again, we weren't sure what was going to happen. And they have, the actual collections have exceeded even what their original estimates were. So we've brought sales taxes back up as well. There's a handful of other changes in tax revenue, and there's been some changes in charges for services, so fees for recreation and things like that, because the recreation department in particular is now, are operating at almost full strength again, and they will be full strength by next year, whereas they had completely shut down during COVID. So there's a significant increase in revenue, but you'll also see that there's a significant increase in expenses. And some of that is due to the increase in the pension UAL. Now, I will say that because of the ROSI 2021 increase, investment gain that CalPERS had, the actual UAL for 2024 is slightly lower than this, but staff didn't want to lower the UAL for 2024 and then have a huge increase in 2025. We wanted to kind of even that out a little bit, and so we're suggesting a $3 million contribution as a budget, which if there's the difference between what we actually pay in the UAL and the $3 million would go into that pension reserve fund, or could be an additional contribution where it's something that we would put towards pensions, but we don't want to show that dip in the budget and then just a large increase the next year. And then the majority of the increase to all other is our insurance costs. Insurance costs have gone up across the board. And there was one other thing. What was the other thing?
Heather, while you're looking for that, is insurance costs all kinds of insurance, including health insurance for staff, or what's in?
No, it's liability, workers' comp, and employer
Got it.
relation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Employment practices liability.
There you go. Thank you. I should know that. I'm on the board for that insurance company. Employment practices liability. Insurance. I explained in the staff report, insurances are going up across the board. It's still cost effective for Albany to be in the joint powers that we are currently in. It's just the everywhere insurance is increasing. And can't remember what the second thing was. Staffing, there are a handful of things that go into the increase in staffing. There's contracted increases for unions. All three unions have contracted increases for 2024. The fire and police union will need to be negotiated this year. So that would go, their contracts currently end in, I think, September and November. And then the Service Employee International Union, or our maintenance and clerical workers, their contract is through 24 and 25. And then there's also, we've budgeted a 3% increase for unrepresented staff. And then we also recently did a salary survey of, we contracted with, I think it was Ralph Anderson and Associates. And we had them review the salaries of comparable positions in comparable agencies. And there are certain staff, mainly unrepresented, and the SEIU union, that are severely under even the median salaries that are being paid in comparable agencies. So, understanding that that increasing and bringing staff salaries up to the 50th percentile is a significant amount, we are requesting that we do that over the next 3 years. Bring them up to where the salary survey says that salaries should be over the next 3 years. That cost is approximately, including benefits, both salary and benefits, is approximately $310,000 each year. So there are some positions that are each position is affected differently, and the analysis would bring each position in line comparable. Now, having said that, we will be bringing to council the changes to unrepresented. Even adjusting the salaries for SEIU has to go through negotiations. So that is, but we've included the budget to do that pending negotiations. That is it for me.
Questions?
In a past staff report, you stated that the percentage of the general fund that went to city staff, salaries, benefits, and pensions was 70%. Are we still, does this plan stay in that percentile, or does it go up or down?
Are you the compensation study plan or the presented budget?
When I communicate to people about that's just that number that I remembered from the very beginning. You know, our budget was approximately 25 million, and of that, the general fund budget, and I can see it printed in your report that you gave to us, that it said 70% of that goes to staff, salaries, benefit, and pensions. So not the unfunded pension liability, but the pension, the contributions that we were obligated to put in on a thing. So I'm just trying to figure out, is that percentage going forward going to be higher or lower?
Assuming the numbers here the salaries and benefits are 60% of the total expenses.
That's good then. I mean, you're saying that we'll basically have more money, a bigger percentage of our budget that isn't going to salaries, pensions. Wait, it's 31.
So if salaries are only 60% of budget and they were about 70% of budget a few years ago, what's making that difference?
So I just added back in the pension UAL, and it's still 70%. I think we were including
okay.
the pension UAL
Okay.
in, because that, I mean, technically that is staff
That is benefits,
costs.
yeah. Yep. 70 even. It's the same. Other questions? I have a couple.
Yeah.
So when we were at the midpoint of the current fiscal year, we thought we were going to realize a deficit for fiscal 22-23. But now it looks like there's going to be about a $986,000 surplus. What accounts for that?
So we're still seeing increases in the property transfer tax that are not that, so it's above budget. And it might even come in higher than this, but that is part of what I'm seeing, and we are again seeing salary staffing. We're seeing staffing vacancies. I can tell you flat out, the person that was doing payroll left because they got a higher paying job somewhere else. So we are just staffing turnover. We're always going to have some of that. So that is part of where we're not seeing the deficit that we thought we were going to have.
So the staffing requests that are in the next budget cycle for fiscal 23-24, does that assume 100% full staffing from day one?
It does. And the reason for that is, again, where I talked earlier about how the operating budget, we want it to be stable, and we don't want to see these large ups and downs in the operating budget, because it's very difficult to plan that way. I mean, we wouldn't know how much money we'd need, how much revenue we'd need if we didn't budget for what staffing would cost. And in addition to that, if, a lot of these positions we're actively recruiting for now. Now, we might not get any applicants or any qualified applicants, or not the right applicant. In certain positions, we're really picky, like police. We want to find the right fit for Albany. So we are actively recruiting, and we expect it to be filled, but it might not be filled. But if I don't budget for it being filled, I can't fill it when we do get the right person.
Right. I get that. I'm just wondering, what's the historical staffing percentage, or how many open positions have we had over the last, say, 5 years? Are we sort of 95% staffed across all of the departments? Or, could you hazard a guess on that, or do you have numbers on that?
I'd say 85 to 90% staffed depending. But I don't off the top of my head know what the dollar value is because it really depends on which position is vacant at any given time.
Right, so if you assumed that 10% just sort of went completely even across everything, that'd be about $1.8 million. If we had a 10% vacancy rate through the year. I'm just trying to kind of come up with some sort of a likelihood. I understand why you budget the way you do so that you can fill the positions when they become empty or when someone presents that you can hire. But just from what's your best guess, what the deficit will really be. And it seems like this has kind of borne out over the last few years where we've budgeted deficits, but then we've actually had surpluses because of empty positions. So is it possible that the deficit might actually be lower by, 1.5 million, 1.8 million, something like that, if the staffing difficulties continue?
Can I rephrase that or put it a different way and ask if we would ever spend over that 18.78 million?
We will never spend over the 18.7 million. I am legally not required to unless we go to council and ask them for more money.
So for budgeting, should we put in a number that is more likely that we might actually spend? Because I feel like every other line item in here, you could go over or under it, except for that one. That's like the max we would ever spend on salaries.
So I will clarify. I can't go over this number.
Okay.
We can't go over this number. In here, the way the resolution is worded can go up or down, but we cannot go over the total amount appropriated. Now, having said that, if we do lower this number for whatever reason, and we have the year that we are fully staffed, but we anticipated not being fully staffed, I have to come back to council and ask for more money, or I can't cut checks.
I see.
Comment on that, Mark?
So, yeah, I mean, in general, I think it makes it hard for me to look at the reasonability of a budget when there's a large deficit. I consider a pretty large deficit budgeted, and it's not really tied to what last year's or the last few years' expenses are. Like in total, the expenses from 2 years ago were 25.4 million. Expenses anticipated for this year will end up at 26 million, and then the department request is over 31 million. So that's a really big increase. And it's just hard to get a sense of like, what's that really going to be and what's really driving that? I just did some quick numbers, and police and fire together are going up 10%, which is nowhere near the increase from 26 to 31. Insurance is going up about 10%. So there's something in there that's going up 25% or something like that. It just seems like a very large increase. And so, okay, to put this as a question, so it says it's labeled department requests. So is this staff's recommendation to city council or to us that this be the 23-24 budget, or is this like you've worked this over with all the departments and this is really what, or is this just what everybody requested, or is this like really your best go at what ought to be budgeted?
So this, I should have renamed this, but this is staff's best estimate at what it will cost to provide the services and programs that have been requested and are legally required.
Well, I share the concern that's been expressed about the increase in the expenses, but I'm also not so optimistic that the revenue is going to continue to be as healthy as it has been. And I know that, real estate's still selling and the prices are still going up, and now we're going to have to pay even more for a loan than you did yesterday. So, I mean, the transfer taxes will probably continue to be high, but I just am not comfortable with assuming another $1 million in income, $1.5 million almost in revenue, in a time when we're really looking at some pretty serious economic indicators contrary to that notion. So I'm concerned both on the revenue and expense projection side that maybe we need to figure out a way to dial it back just a tad. I don't have any specific recommendations, but those are my comments.
I guess the other thing that sort of compounds this, and this goes back to my comment about the general fund reserve balance, was just did some quick math on it. And so if we start at 10.7 and we do realize a $2.5 million deficit, then our reserve fund balance goes to about 8.2 at the end of June 30, 2024. And then if we do realize another, $3.6 million deficit in the next fiscal year, we're down to 4.5. So we're clearly out of compliance with our reserve fund policy at that point. And that just makes me think, and also the other thing about the 25 budget is the expenses increased by 1.6 million, but the revenue only increases by 439,000. And we can't do that. That's not sustainable. So if you're increasing your expenses at that much greater of a pace than you're increasing your revenue, you can't sustain it. And then when you look at the general fund reserve analysis, we're out of compliance. We're not at 25% anymore after 2 years of that. And we're just getting started with the UAL payments really starting to ramp up, because then they're going to move into the 4 million and north of 4 million territory after 25. So I don't know what the specific answers are, but it just seems incredibly unsustainable, the numbers that are presented. And I guess that's why I was sort of looking at, well, what do we really think the staffing would be at? Because are we really looking at a $2.5 million deficit for next year, or will it not be that bad? Maybe it's more like $1 million or something, which still isn't great, but not as bad. I guess that's a question. Is there are 5%, the expenses go up by 5% in 25, and so I'm wondering what that's related to. Or is it just more of the same comments as you had for 24?
I think so, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, does no one see an issue with this? I just don't see how we can approve a budget like this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I guess I feel like the budget, it's a different philosophy, right? It's just, to me, the budget is, you budget what you can afford. And I think you're exactly right. I don't think the 2-year outlook of this is what we can afford. It's out of compliance. So you budget what you can reasonably afford. And then if you need extra staff, or you need to make some adjustments that are outside the budget, then you need to get city council's approval. Like that's the idea. But this is kind of asking for pre-approval to spend outside of what I think the city can afford, at least for 2 years.
It's interesting, because we just talked about the non-administrative policies before this. And one of the points in there is if the general fund reserve balance falls below 25%, one of the remedies is cut your expenses, because it's 25% of expenses. And so if the budgeted expenses are 32 million, 25% of that is $8 million. And we're gonna be at 4.5 million. So the budget seems to be like in direct contradiction to the general fund reserve policy.
Is what Kim's articulating, does that resonate in terms of the actual like math and calculations that she's doing in terms of how the deficit would impact our general reserve fund and then put us in non-compliance?
You asking me?
Yes.
So I agree with everything that you're saying. But again, I will reiterate that staff are required to provide certain services by law or by ordinance or anything like that. And then staff have also been asked by council or the community or whoever to provide additional services. So the budget is our best guess at telling council and the community, this is what it costs to provide what we are currently providing and what you have requested. So we've cut everywhere that we can. Now, Public Works is a good example of where you're seeing how this number doesn't necessarily, it's rising more than we actually plan on spending. And some of that is Public Works, where Public Works budgets for certain things that, we hope don't happen or don't necessarily happen every year. But a conversation I had with a Public Works director at one point is a good point. I was like, okay, you've never spent this $90,000 line. Why do you keep asking for it? And he said, because if one traffic thing breaks, it costs that much to replace that one part. So he has to budget for it in case it happens, but it hadn't happened for years. But the number of years that it doesn't happen increases the likelihood that it's gonna happen. So Public Works generally ideally is going to be within, 80% spent on their budget. But again, if I don't have the authorization to spend that money, I literally cannot, as treasurer, cut the check. So ideally, obviously, I would come before we got close to be like, hey, we're getting close, I need this. But if there was an emergency, in certain emergencies, the city manager can override and say, for public health reasons, we need this thing. But this is, again, what staff's best estimate is to provide the services and programs that are currently being requested.
So I have two comments. So one is on that example, I feel like that's a great example why you would have a reserve fund, so that you would have a reserve fund for that weird operational thing that happens and that you need to have money for. But to budget for it every year it just throws the budget a little off. But I guess the bigger question or bigger comment is, it seems like our comments about this, at least for me, kind of not being an acceptable deficit would rebound. I think what you're saying, we would rebound it and say, then there's too much being requested of the city. Is that right? In other words, when we say this, this isn't sustainable, you're saying this is what it costs to do what's been requested of us. So then the obvious next step is, what are the priorities of what's being requested of you, and does that have to be adjusted so that we are on a sustainable path? And is there some method for the city council, or are things presented to the city council in a way that they can prioritize things and understand and make those hard choices?
So we've tried to present things as here are our core services and, what we, those legally required things and all of that kind of stuff. And as council requests different programs and, different opportunities, we do put a cost on some of those things. I hope that the budget booklet that will be presented to council will provide some of those policy insights. But yes, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head.
I think that's our recommendation with respect to this budget, is I think everyone needs to go back and look at what they've requested and cut some things out, because it's not sustainable. We're asking for too much. If that's what this spending represents, it's more than the revenue, and we can't sustain it. I would like to know how much, realistically, I know why you're budgeting for full salary, every position filled every day of the year, but realistically, what might really happen, and, is it possible we break even, or is that not even a possibility? Maybe we run $1 million deficit, or because we have to budget the way we do. I think we're forced to budget unrealistically, right, for certain things that maybe could be handled with a reserve fund, or budgeting for some open positions or something like that. And so it'd be nice to have sort of a, well, this is the way we have to budget, but this is what we think might be the realistic outcome. Because we have seen that the budgeted deficits for the last several years have not materialized, and we have had surpluses for at least the last 2 years, maybe more. And so maybe that puts council in a position where they think, oh, it's not going to happen. We're not really going to run these deficits. It's just play money. It's not real. And so they're just encouraged to spend more.
Yeah, sorry, is this common to budget for a deficit and then you expect a surplus or expect a balanced budget?
No, that is not a common thing.
But I agree with Kim, it'd be nice to see the actual expected budget once you factor in the probability of these things actually occurring. Or at the very least, I think, to be transparent, if this is what we're budgeting, we show the impact over time on the balance of the general fund reserve and how it's going to be out of compliance if this actually comes to fruition.
That is definitely something that I can and most likely will address in my in the biennial budget package to council. One thing, I completely agree that some of those one-time things are something that can be addressed with reserve funds. As I said earlier, the reserve funds are fairly new. I know it says 2020, but at the same time, everything's kind of been in flux since 2020. And so we're just now kind of getting into a groove with those reserve funds. And as part of the biennial budget package to council, staff will be requesting just a blanket, can we have $100,000 in the general city reserve, the general city building reserve fund for those one-time items. However, the issue is, these numbers do not count on funding those reserves. So you can do that for a small amount of time, but then it has to come back into the budget if you're not funding the reserves through the operating budget.
And this operating budget does have some set-asides for the reserves, right?
It has a handful of them, and then in addition, we plan on using any of the leftover equipment lines, like if we haven't spent all of the equipment lines in certain areas, to move that money into reserves to fund for future equipment purchases. But there's no like significant funding. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars instead of the hundreds of thousands that, you know, would be needed over time.
Heather, I'm not an accountant, so I'm going to float an idea that may have no accounting value at all. But what if you took the third quarter of the prior two years' salaries, and you projected that out as the salary budget going forward, and then you backfilled or filled the reserve fund as much as you could departmentally, and any hiring that happened was funded, but funded through reserve funds? Would that, I mean, is that just magic that couldn't happen? Or I'm just trying to get to Kim's point of, you know, we've got these big numbers, but we got empty seats. And is there a way to take care of both of those in a budget?
My concern with funding reoccurring items like salaries with reserve funds or even special revenue funds is you don't actually see what the impact is. Here, you know that if you want to have this level of service, you need to get more revenue. And if we're putting them in different reserve funds or in, you know, different places, you don't see that impact. Or you don't see it until it's too late. You don't see it until the next year when you're like, oh, wow, I have all of these salaries that I have to pay and I don't have enough revenue bringing it in.
Okay, I get it.
Counting wise, yes, I can do pretty much anything you want within the bounds of the law. But whether that is, and we did a lot of work in, I think it was either 2019 or 2020, to bring expenses that were previously spread out through a number of special revenue funds into the general fund and then add in the transfers from the special revenue funds, so you really see what it actually costs to run the city. Because prior to that, the expenses were spread out over so many different funds that it was even hard for the department to know where things were. And so bringing it all together like this, I think kind of hit home is as to, oh, this is what we're spending. But there were a lot of shifting parts. You know, we switched finance directors a few times. There were just different changes in how things were presented, you know, like presenting the sugar sweetened beverage tax. It was unclear to council in the beginning that it wasn't a special revenue fund. And so, you know, bringing all of these things together, I completely agree. We need a plan for how we're going to address this. But a lot of this is going to be at the, staff can't necessarily cut more and provide the services that we need to or have been requested.
Comments, Francesca?
Yeah, I have questions about some expenses and some revenues. On page 7 of 17, the police salaries and wages. Can you go through from fiscal year 2022 actuals as to give us an idea of how many officers? So my understanding now is that maybe the salaries and wages in this 192 is for the police officers. And then 193 could be for the dispatchers and others who are part of the support.
Correct. So the operations are the officers and the lieutenants and sergeants, and then the support services are dispatchers and the I cannot remember what the title of that one position is. They deal with evidence and things like that. And then there are a handful, the salaries under admin are the chief and the administrative lieutenant and the some administrative assistant help.
Chief and lieutenant. Okay, so both of those positions are filled. So when we're talking about 192, how many positions are you funding in the, did we fund in the actuals? And how many did you estimate for 2023, which is now, correct? And then, so it's really, I'm just trying, because this is, that was, I remember that this was a source, one of the major sources of our ability to not, we budgeted a deficit, but we had a surplus because we budgeted for a full police operations, but because he's trying to hire 24, police officers, but we're only doing around 20. So do you have a count of, if a full force is 24, how many are we, what was the actual paying?
I do not know off the top of my head. In addition, it's not a stagnant number throughout the year. It changes as people leave and are hired.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like a fraction of a person as well.
Okay.
But I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Well, can I get it so that in the future I'm just thinking this is just one item and I wanted to, I think it's a good example of how we budget for a full staff, and we want you to do that. I want you to do that, at least in this department, but that it seems to be a pretty big fluctuation between what actually happens or not, because this is a difficult. And that, all right, and so I'd like to get that information in the future so that when I can run that by the chief and compare. The other thing is the real estate, page 4. I went into the multiple listing service today, and I did a search of single-family homes, all the residential units, single-family homes, condos, and multiple units from 2 units up to 5 and above. For the first quarter of 2021, first quarter of 2022, and the first quarter of 2023. In 2021, there were 32 units that sold in. This is just what goes through the MLS. There can be off-market sales. There could be, and transfers that may be parent to child or inherited that get where the property assessment gets reassessed. If you inherit a property, then the assessed value gets reassessed. But just in terms of the market, so we get 2021, there were 32 units sold at an average price of $1.18 million for a total of $35.8 million. 2022, there were 33 units at an average price of 1.243, and that was 41 million in value. That would be taxable transfer tax. This year, during the same period, there were only 27 units. The average price was 1.246, the same as last year. But because there's fewer units, there was only 33 million in sales. So what I'm seeing is approximately a 20% reduction in number of units and approximately a 20% reduction in the value that's going to be chargeable, a transfer tax will be able to charge against this. And so in your transfer tax, you have an actual for 2022 of 3.2 million. And then you're budgeting for a very drastic reduction in transfer tax of 2 million for 2023. And then for 2024, you have it again, I think it's 2 million. So I think that that's going to be better. I mean, you've done like a 40% reduction, something like that. And so that seems ultra conservative. I'm not complaining, I'm just observing because this is what I can pull these numbers up. And then for the property taxes, and this is the part I'm always a little bit, I kind of understand, I do understand. We have property tax revenue, and the reason why I'm going through this so carefully is that these two numbers are approximately property tax, transfer tax and property tax is approximately $12 million, which is around 50% of our revenue. So understanding the trends in 50% of our revenue stream, you know, and budgeting in that way seems to be important. And that also seemed, when I recall, over our last 2 years, there was this, you know, we budgeted for 3 million and we got 4 million or whatever it was. It was, you know, so. Now, property taxes, when the assessed value does not go down, it only goes up. And I did do I can pull up the records, the property records on any property. And there was some reason why last year the assessed value went up only 1%. Well, all the other years it goes up 2%. This is what I do every day. So these numbers stick in my head. So everyone's assessed value will be going up, though, 2% this year. So I looked into that, and I'm talking about my own house. Okay, looked up my own house, said 2%. So if the assessed value goes up 2% a year, then you seem to be budgeting somewhat correctly here for the 9.6 million. If all the assessed values, but that doesn't include all the new sales. Because, and here's what I want people to understand. Many of these sales of these places that I just sold a condo last week in which the assessed value was like 200,000 and it sold for 375,000. So that's like a big jump. And many of these, as the older buildings and people who have had their house for 20, 30 years, there's a big jump. So the question, so I'm just trying to figure out, is there a way, and I'd be glad to help, and or how does the the property assessor give you this information, which we can be deemed more reliable, because this is 50% of our budget, of our revenue stream.
So the property taxes and the property transfer taxes, I'm going to address separately because they are not really related in the way that I estimate them. The property taxes, when I first came to Albany, we were not hitting the amount that we were budgeting for the past, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years. So I did not increase the property tax line that first year when I was here for a budget. After that, I started to increase it, and then we hit COVID, and we didn't know what was going to happen. So clearly things have changed. When I get the information from the assessor, I get assessed value, not necessarily property tax amounts. And the property tax line that you see here is several different taxes. There's the tax on real property, there's unsecured property tax, there's property tax in lieu, and I think there's something else. So there's a handful of different amounts that go into this line. Now, unsecured property has gone down during COVID because businesses shut down, and we did not have as many, there wasn't as much unsecured property to assess. So this line, as you can see, I have increased it fairly significantly by almost $2 million. It's a 22% increase from what was previously budgeted. So this is a fairly significant increase and will go up depending on, the next year, depending on what we see. If, there's been a lot of renovations, so those have affected property or the taxable value as well. But we anticipate those to slow down, especially with interest rates rising and all of that. So there's a couple of different things that go into here, so I can't really just take what the assessor gives me and say, that's the number in this line.
Heather, can I ask you a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
You are increasing the property tax revenue budget by a huge amount over the 23 budget, but the 23 year-end estimate is 9.6 million. And so the increase of a $10 million budget next year over the 9.6 that we think we're going to take in is really only 4%.
Right.
And wouldn't we want to compare against the actuals? Because to Francesco's point, these, pretty much almost every sale, I would think, the assessed value is going way up over whatever it was assessed at before the sale.
So the taxes for for fiscal year 24 are all, the tax assessed value is already set. It was your January 1st, 2023 property value. So I was told by the assessor that Albany's assessed value went up approximately 5.5%. But
By
again,
how much?
5.5%.
Okay.
But again, there's other numbers in that line. So the 9.6 million isn't just the property taxes. It's the unsecured property taxes and tax in lieu. I think there's one other thing.
Well, can that be broken down, or do you just get in so that we can analyze it? I mean, that's the 9 million. I mean, we're supposed to be trying to understand, revenue streams, And 9 million is not property tax alone. So is in the future, can we now have property tax broken down? We've discussed this in the past, and this is exactly why we need to have, if it includes unsecured and in lieu, then why can't we break down those three figures, that 9 million into three figures?
I can provide that to you. Again, there's a balance between the information that is provided and how much information is too much information when these reports are provided. I'm not saying it's too much information for you guys, but I have definitely been in meetings where no one wants to look at anything that I present because it's just a bunch of numbers. So I can definitely provide those numbers to you.
It's not just a bunch of numbers, it's the biggest numbers in the whole budget. So it's just not that's why it needs to be broken down. So I'm not asking you to do it with everything, I'm saying with, and I feel very similar to the sales and use taxes and the franchise and other taxes to be broken down in a similar manner. So when someone is analyzing trends about growth, which we were just presented in the last segment of our agenda item, that we can see, well, yes, there's a poor performance in sales and use taxes because the sales taxes went up, and instead we just have to hear your analysis of it versus I would like to see that number. And they're pretty big numbers. And it's not transparent to me how our revenue stream comes when 1, 2, 3, the 9 million, 4 million, and 6 million, which adds up to 19 million of our 23 million, are in 3 lines. I would like to see those 3 items broken down so that we see how you come up with budgeting these numbers. And as I said, we'll see trends, because we need revenue to pay for the pension and to pay our projected deficit. And how can we, so I think this is vital. I've asked in the past. I think we need it now, not later. And I would like to get those numbers in a format that is easy to understand. Not in some spreadsheet, but just in a table, just like this. Can I get those? I mean, so we can.
That is not something that I just have on hand. This is something that takes me hours and hours and hours of work every time I put it together for you guys, which is something that I do. And I do because I want to make sure that you have all of these things. But these numbers don't just appear like this.
Is it a thing where I'm not sure how you have your chart of accounts set up and how that rolls into your books and stuff, but I assume you probably have different line items for these different, secured and unsecured and those types of things that are just all kind of rolling up into this number. So it's a matter of having to kind of go back to the GL and disaggregate numbers and stuff like that?
And Cassie can tell you, our GL is hundreds of accounts long.
Oh, yeah, I get it. I'm just wondering where do we go from here? I'm looking at the time, first of all. It's 10:10. And before we can even move on to another topic, we'll have to have a vote if we're going to continue the meeting tonight or postpone topics. But what's the process from here? Where do we go with this. I think we have a lot of comments about this budget and a lot of concerns, and I know that I am scheduled to go talk to City Council on May 15th. And I'd like to have somebody else from this body come with me to talk to them. And we can certainly address our concerns about the budget, and we're also going to talk about the pension, and we're giving the work plan report too, I think. I think I'm doing 3 things on that. But, so where do we go from here? What's the procedure? I think we've got concerns about this, and I think the message to council is like, hey, we need you guys to rethink, you know, what you need based on the unsustainability of the budget as it's presented here, and start that conversation. If we do that, does it then go back to does it come back to us for this May 24th meeting? Is there another council budget study session after that? Or is it just kind of, we say our piece and then the council is going to take a vote and it's over? Like, what happens next?
Sure. So the council has their study session on May 15th, and they will do similar to what you guys have done, ask a bunch of questions, and we'll go through a number of different things. And then generally what happens is they give staff direction, and we go back and we make any changes that they've requested. And then it's kind of new having the Financial Advisory Committee, so I don't know whether they would send it back to you guys or what would happen then. But generally, after the study session and after we make the changes, it goes for a first reading that is scheduled for the June 1st, is it June 1st, I think, council meeting? Is that Monday? No, June 5th council meeting. And then it would go for a second reading, their second meeting in May. So if there were any additional changes that needed to be made after that first reading, we would do that if necessary.
Second meeting in June, you mean?
Yes, I'm so sorry, yes.
Okay.
I'd like to move that we continue the meeting until 10:30.
I'll second that.
Aye.
Can you take a vote on that, Heather, or do
Yeah, hold on. And Kim seconded
I seconded?
to continue to 10:30. Member Bowman?
Yes.
Member Carr?
Yes.
Member Papalia?
Yes.
Vice Chair Priven?
Yes.
And Chair Trainer?
Yes.
And then just my thoughts in terms of responding to your questions, Kim. I think most of the council members that I've ever had conversations with listen to our meeting. So our comments are not into the air here tonight. They're being heard. The public is open and listening to the meeting as well. So I think I'm not sure we need to take a definitive action other than to continue the conversation possibly on May 24th, again on June 5th, and then on second read of the budget. And we can do that as council, as individuals to the council, or we can do it as commission with a statement if we want to make a formal statement. But that's how I understand. And if Heather, if that's incorrect, please correct me. But I also want to comment that our requests to Heather that take 3 or 4 hours are just an echo of what's happened over the years to the city budget. We continue to ask the city staff to do more and more and more, and every time we ask them, they do it, and every time they do it, it costs more money. So we need to be a little bit mindful of that when we start asking for stuff. That's all.
I will say
And
there's
I know it's
wonderful
not-
software that can do this for us, but it is $13,000 and I wasn't willing to spend it.
I think that was a good choice.
And I'm an accountant. I know that there is a perception by the general public that you just push a button and the report comes spitting out the other side, but it's never that simple, and I'm sure that it's really time-consuming to produce these reports. I think it's, yeah. So what do we
So
want to?
I just want to, I understand. So I'm not going to get the information. We're not going to get the information. The public's not going to get the information about a breakdown of 9 million, 4.895 million, and a breakdown of 6.796 million, because it will take too much time. It will cost too much money. And our job is to show the public how we get our money, transparency, accountability. If you have to spend money to get transparency and accountability, then we need to spend the money. I just get the same answer, and I think it's a failure of lack of accountability and transparency, and I'm beyond frustrated.
I very specifically said I could give you the information. It just might not be pretty, because that is what takes time, is formatting these things and presenting them in a way that is something that is easy to understand and easy to, that people can look at and say, oh, I get that. I know where that comes from. It doesn't just come out of the system like that. I can definitely provide anything that anyone wants. It's just the format in which it comes out is not necessarily what I can easily provide data. I can't necessarily provide it in a way that is as approachable as what you're seeing, if you could call this approachable.
I mean, what about a GL report and you say, look at the accounts in this numerical range because this is where you're going to find all these numbers, and it might be 100 different accounts.
I'm not an accountant. I read numbers. I analyze numbers. I deal with it all the time in real estate. Okay, so if you're going to the public deserves to have it in a format that they can understand. The committee deserves to have it in a format that is easily to understand. So if you're what you're saying is that I can't do it, you can't do it, you're saying that the council doesn't deserve it either. And I know that there are many people in the council that would like to know some of these things, and they just kind of shrug because they've tried, and time after time, it just gets shrugged off. Because you say that it's too hard to do it so people can understand it.
Can I just suggest
I don't get it.
Can I suggest maybe a compromise at the risk of putting myself into the middle of this? I think it's a great request, but it's not something we need quarterly. And I guess part of what I'm thinking of is, Heather, I think this takes a lot of time, but you provide this quarterly. And really, we're only doing this analysis like for the budget or maybe once a year when we're looking at how are general trends and stuff. So maybe we could have just more of an update quarterly, but then more detail along the lines of what you're asking for when we really take the time to sink into it. Does that make sense?
I'm not quite sure what you're offering here in terms of what's possible. I would just like to know, in the last fiscal year, the actuals, okay? That's all. And then that's a place to start. There's actuals in this thing, and it doesn't mean anything to me. It's just these big numbers. And the public doesn't understand. Doesn't understand it. I know they don't understand it, and I don't understand it. And as I said, it's 70 to 80% of the revenue. I mean, is that how you run your life? Oh, just someone says, oh, here's your money's going to come, 70, 80% is coming into these three sources, and of these three sources, there's around 8 to 10 sources in those three sources, and just trust me, this is what's happening.
Well, that, I mean, that's just the reporting quagmire that we find ourselves in. And I think it is possible to get a GL report,
What's a GL report?
the general ledger, which lists all the transactional detail, and she's saying she's probably got, I don't know, 100 accounts or something. I'm not sure how many sub-accounts you guys have. Maybe it's not that many. It's a lot.
Our chart of
and
accounts is over 7 pages long when printed out.
Yeah, so basically you get this report that shows all the transactional detail. There might be, 50 to 100 different sub-accounts that feed this line that says property tax. Some will be secured, some will be unsecured, just other types
I
of
thought
things.
she said there were 3. I heard her say secured, which is
Right, and unsecured.
unsecured,
Right.
and what was the third one?
There's
Whatever.
a
In
property
lieu.
tax in lieu.
So I thought I heard 3 lines.
Well, there's more accounts than that for whatever reason.
How many in that tax, in the property tax, it's more than 3? Because that's what I heard. I heard you say property tax in lieu and
Unsecured.
unsecured. So I heard 3. And that's all I want, was the summary of those 3. But that can't be done, I guess.
What if you can you give us the chart of accounts? And I could just sort of try to walk people through just to give an idea of what types of things feed into these different line items, just to give some sense of what's required, because I don't know myself, but you say the chart of accounts runs to 7 pages. So, and is there a mapping of the chart of accounts that you have that's easy? I don't want you to do something else, but is there something that says, okay, these 5 different accounts feed the property tax line, or whatever? Do you have something like that?
I can send you the Excel spreadsheet that I use to create this report. It has a couple of pivot tables that feed into it, and I can attempt to explain the method behind it. I'm not saying that people won't understand it. I'm saying it is just a massive spreadsheet. But I can, of course, I can provide whatever is requested. It's just providing it in a specific format is what takes time.
I would say if you could just provide the Excel schedule that backs this up with the pivot tables and the data that it's drawing from, we can read that. I mean, well, some of us probably can, and try to interpret it, just to give an idea of what numbers are feeding that, and then probably, I don't know, I could probably come up with it. I'm not sure how long it would take me, but I could probably come up with the various accounts that feed that number.
I can send that to you tomorrow.
All right, so what are we going to do about the council budget study session? I'll be going, I'd like to have one other person from this committee go with me.
To just address Judy's question about, I have actually asked that the Financial Advisory Committee present to the council during their study session so that you can get your thoughts and all of your recommendations out without staff being the go-between. So this is what we have requested, that the Financial Advisory Committee be represented at the budget study session.
Is there anybody that can go with me? I think you said you were going to be gone.
I'm going to be out of
right?
town, yeah.
No?
I can go on the 15th.
Okay. All right, so I have some backup. So I'll review the recording of this session, and I'm just going to compile a list of our comments about this budget. And then Kyle and I, so it's okay for.
Could I just ask one clarification?
Yeah.
Were you asking?
I can do it.
I think. Heather, were you referencing the Finance Advisory Committee presenting at the June meetings or the May meeting?
The May 15th study
I'm sorry,
session.
it's getting late for me, and I heard June, so I can make a May meeting, so there'll be 3 of us that can possibly be there
Okay.
then.
Well, I think that's fine.
Can you do that?
Can we have 3 people
I
there?
don't think that's,
It's
No.
it's a noticed public meeting, so yes.
All right, so I'll review the recording of this meeting. I'll make a list of all of our comments, and then if you two can join me, then you can chime in to fill in what I'm missing. And then are we also allowed to talk about the pension update at that meeting?
I will have your memo as part of the budget package, and so you are more than welcome to talk about the pension at that time.
Okay, and we have 2 memos now. There's the one from July of '22, which I don't think made its way to council, and then there's the one from April.
I was planning on putting the most recent memo from both committees in the budget package.
Can we have that July memo in there? Because I don't think they've ever seen it.
If you can resend that to me, I will make sure that they are both in there.
Okay. And that's a 7 PM start for that meeting?
No, the study session will be before it. I am not positive what time it will be. Study sessions are normally at 6, but this might be earlier. I will confirm as soon as I know.
Okay, great.
So this budget document will be shared with council at that meeting. I know this is an additional ask, but to Kim's point earlier, are we able to show basically the impact of running this deficit on the general reserve fund over time? I think that's a valuable point that we'd speak to, and it sounds like staff is in agreement that that would occur should the budget that's forecasted here materialize.
So this will be part of a larger budget package. If you have not yet, I suggest going to the one that was presented at the last biennial budget. It will have the same format where it includes all the policies and it includes all of this information, but it also includes a section on the reserve funds. It includes a section on the special revenue funds. And like the master fee schedule update, there's a lot of data, and I think the last biennial budget package was 208 pages long, and I've added more. So there will be, I think in there at some point, I can definitely put in, even if it's just in the staff report, I can put in, how this would affect the general fund. Basically reiterating that a budgeted deficit is basically just being funded by the general fund balance.
I think that'd be great to put in the staff report.
So I think we need to take public comment on this. We're right at just about our 10:30 time limit. Is there public comment? Okay, we had 2 more topics scheduled for this agenda, and I'd like to propose that we discuss those topics at the next meeting. One of the topics was the draft schedule. And we were talking about a May 24th meeting on that draft schedule. So I guess the question is, will we hold that May 24th meeting? Or is the next meeting June 7th? And do we need a motion to, postpone items 6.4 and 6.5 to next meeting?
I think we do need a motion.
I will make that motion to postpone.
And I second.
Do the vote on that?
I'm trying to copy down too many different things. Give me 1 second.
6.4 and 6.5 to postpone.
Yes.
I believe the Revenue Subcommittee was one of the committees that was going to be reporting at the next, at the May 15th meeting, but I think we can delay the report on that, so I'm comfortable with that, given that we're looking for more information on revenue.
Okay. And who, I'm sorry, who seconded that motion?
Kerr.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, Member Bowman?
Yes.
Member Carr?
Yes.
Member Papalia?
Yes.
Vice Chair Priven?
Yes.
And Chair Trainer?
Yes.
Motion passes.
7 is future agenda items. So I guess that'll be 6.4 and 6.5. And I do believe that we had a couple of other things that have been postponed to the June meeting. My notes said we'd be doing the Q3 finance and budget update at that meeting. Also dashboard metrics report. Discussion of bank credit risk. Investment committee update. Those are the things on my list.
At some point this year, I would like to have and I'd like to make a presentation, and I'd be glad to do it with anyone else, about how property taxes are paid. And taking in a tax bill and explaining it and going over it and seeing how things change. My experiences with the public and people that I know very, very well, who are sophisticated in a lot of different things, but when it comes to paying their tax bill, they know they have to pay it twice a year, and that's about it. And I think
Guilty.
okay? And I think I just illustrated that a very large part of our revenue stream comes from real estate taxes, and understanding how those assessed values are calculated, how they change, and also to compare a property that hasn't transferred in 30 years, that is right next door and has approximately the same property value of $1.2 million as the house next door, may have an assessed value of $200,000, while the next door neighbor who purchased it last year is paying an assessed value of an assessed value of 1.2 million. And if we understand that, it might help inform many of our decisions about taxes and what's equitable and how they're distributed throughout the city.
Okay, so item 8 is the next meeting. So the next meeting date is scheduled for Wednesday, June 7th at 7 p.m. And the time is 10:34. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.